This is a Speyside. This is a lowland. Said no one ever. If you walk into pretty much any bar in the world where there's a Scottish whisky selection, chances are the menu will be laid out into 5 regions: Speyside, Highland, Lowland, Campbeltown and Islay, potentially with an ensuing conversation between guest and bartender, with the guest saying, what is the difference between a Speyside and a Highland single malt? And the resulting answer may or may not be the yearbook definition of what is a Scottish whisky region's flavour: light and floral, fruity and rich. All of the things that stem from us talking a lot about SWA regulations, lines on a map, the impact of wine terroir and regionality on the perception of Scottish whisky's flavour. But of course, with 48 distilleries spread over a 10,000 square mile region of the Highlands, who all make their own independent decisions about the size of their stills, fermentation times, cut points, yeast strains, cask styles, how can we all confidently say that the Highlands has a specific flavour and regional style? But with smaller whisky regions like Campbeltown and Islay offering up a smaller demographic distilleries who give a much more concentrated flavour profile like peated or funky or oily, then of course the concept of regionality becomes much more complex than the Beckham family feud. So the question does indeed become, is regionality still relevant to Scottish whisky's flavour? But before we get into it, why do we have Scottish whisky regionality in the first place? So back in 1784, Prime Minister William Pitt split Scotland into 2 distinct whisky-making regions, the Highlands and the Lowlands, which was done for taxation purposes. Part of the idea was to lower excise duties in the Highlands to try and discourage illicit distillation and whisky smuggling, but actually had the opposite effect, leading to, in effect, things like smaller still sizes, because if you're hiding out in the Highlands in what is now Speyside, up in the hills in the bothies away from the tax and excise men, it's a bit easier to hide your stills if they're a bit smaller, actually leading to a more robust and heavy character. The Lowlands, on the other hand, ended up with a much more lighter style due to a more industrialisation approach, trying to save on costs and taxes. For example, switching away from peat to coal for malting barley. And then when 1830 and the coffee still came along, they started producing much more single grain because they could produce much more higher outputs, which exponentially exploded when the advent of blending came along in the mid-1800s. So with the Lowlands, the Highlands and Speyside all moving away from peat usage over time, Islay has remained that constant, with 90% of its distilleries still producing constant peated expressions. Speyside is a funny one, however, as the original whiskies from the region were either branded Glenlivet or known as Strathspey since the mid-1800s, and Speyside only officially became recognised as a whisky-making region in 2009 with the Scotch whisky legislation. And some distilleries from Speyside still identify as a Highland single malt, such as Macallan and Glenfarclas, because there's actually no legal stipulation to say you have to be labelled a Speyside whisky if you fall into that region. The 2009 legislation also labels Speyside, Highland and Lowlands as regions, but Islay and Campbeltown as localities, meaning they're too small to actually be known as whisky-making regions, but obviously have a strong historic whisky-making legacy that needs to be preserved. And of course, over time, with other distilleries like Tamdhu, Dalyuen, Aberlour, Craigellachie, Mortlake, the idea that Speyside whiskies and sherry went hand in hand sort of gained traction. And this only really changed after about the 1930s, post-Prohibition, after the Coopers Union in the United States said American whiskies have to be made with new American oak, giving us thousands and thousands of barrels with American oak to put whiskey in Scotland, and then basically diversifying the flavour profile of Scottish whiskies across the board. Now, of course, when one of the whisky regions in Scotland, like Campbeltown, only has 3 distilleries, it can be very easy to say, right, this regionality holds weight because they're producing an oily and funky style, i.e. Springbank and Glengyle. However, Glen Scotia is producing a much wider variety of styles these days. And then, of course, there's the much debated whisky region, which is not official as per SWA definitions or regulations. However, the islands, I feel, and I think a lot of people are in agreement, especially people from the islands, that places like Arran and Orkney and the Hebrides are very much their own whisky regions. Where regionality starts to become a bit more ingrained in whisky education is with the launch of the Classic Malts range in 1988 by UDV, about 10 years before they became Diageo, with a lineup of 6 whiskies from the portfolio, all representing a specific whisky region. So in there you had Glenkinchie from the Lowlands, you had Dalwhinnie from the Highlands, you had Cragganmore from Speyside, you had Talisker from Skye, Lagavulin from Islay, and Oban from the West Highlands. Then, of course, came the whisky regionality maps, which further visually cemented the idea that each whisky region produces a very specific flavour profile. But over the last 20 years, we've seen the opening of 59 new distilleries out of 165, which are beholden to no historical regional style. In fact, the trend we're seeing more of is smaller independent distilleries moving away from standardised industry yeasts, such as Dornick, where Phil and Simon Thompson are using spent ale yeast from Cromarty Brewery just down the road, firmly setting themselves apart from the big Highland distilleries. Even Fife is now known as a non-official whisky-making region with 6 new distilleries in the past 20 years, but all with individual characteristics that set themselves apart very differently, such as Inchdarney, who make rye whisky and also use wine and ale yeasts. I mean, it's very easy to do a lineup of peated drams and a tasting using 5 different whiskies from different regions and not even bring Islay into the equation just to show it's not endemic to one little island. I would say where whiskey regions are still relevant, however, is within tourism and community. If you look at festivals like Fage Isle and Islay, Spirit Speyside Festival, Campbelltown Malts Festival, these are still really important draws for people to go and visit those communities. So on the whole, if I was to say whether or not whiskey regionality is relevant to whiskey flavour, on the whole I would say no, because the way we communicate and educate about whiskey has come a long way since the 1980s. And if I do pick a lineup from a region, let's say I'm picking 5 whiskies from Aberdeenshire, the only reason I'm doing it is to show how vastly different they are. I mean, the next time you're in Glasgow, Edinburgh, look around and see how many people you see smelling the air going, oh, I am definitely in the Central Belt now. But if you are going to design a whiskey menu based on regions, at least combine it with some flavour descriptors on there, because a whiskey from the Highlands is on an indefinable spectrum that is not beholden to lines on a map. Also, if you're planning a trip to Scotland anytime soon, you can check out my website for the new whiskey map of Scotland, fraser-campbell.co.uk, where it has a map of all the current operating distilleries in Scotland, grouped by region, funnily enough, all of which has a key to tell you which ones do and do not have a visitor centre. So please go ahead and use it and share it as much as you want. Cheers.